singer David was just allegedly named a suspect in the crimes against Celeste Rivas Hernandez. For many of you, that doesn't sound crazy considering all of the evidence against him, but this is huge news. Up until today, the police have not said a single word about David or his potential involvement. However, reports from multiple credible news outlets are now saying that police have named him as an official suspect.
David is viewed as a suspect in this case.
Multiple people were involved in the itself and dismembering and concealing of the body, but as you mentioned, David now considered to be a suspect.
But there is also one massive issue with this case, because in addition to naming him as a suspect, these outlets also allege that David is not cooperating with authorities. Not only is this a terrible look, but it's also in direct opposition with the previous claims David's PR team made about him cooperating in full. So much has happened over the last couple days, and even more in just the last couple of hours, that it feels like the walls are slowly closing in and David cannot push them back fast enough. Before these updates that I'm going to go over today, we haven't had any real updates since that person found Celeste in the back of David's car. It's clear that the police want to keep all of their cards close to their chest, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that later. But just today, TMZ dropped a huge report from a credible law enforcement source officially confirming David as a suspect.
David is viewed as a suspect in this case. That may seem obvious, but remember, they have not publicly said anything like that. They have not even said publicly that he is a person of interest. We've spoken to several well-placed sources in law enforcement, and they say that in the investigation, they are viewing him as a suspect.
This is huge news because for the last couple of months, law enforcement has said that he's not officially a suspect, which led a lot of people on the internet to wonder why he wasn't being named as one, and if perhaps he actually might be innocent for some weird reason. And although his relationship with Celeste still would have been weird, there was another Celeste who was of age involved, and it could have possibly been some sort of misunderstanding. But after what we're going to go over today, pretty much all of that is thrown out the window, because as I mentioned in the intro, David is no longer cooperating. At least he isn't, according to this recent report. And in fact, they claim that he was never cooperating at all, even though his PR team promised us that he was just a couple of months ago. But this is just the tip of the iceberg as far as information that's come out recently. I mean, even the Citizen app, one of the most popular public safety apps in the world, sent out a notification that reached 13 million people detailing exactly some of the things that I told you so far, plus a lot more. And for those of you that didn't receive that article or take the time to read it, I'm going to go over that right now. One of the main points that the article brings up makes David and his team look very guilty. They gave a quote from ABC, who were citing an LAPD source when they said that, quote, David has not been cooperative in the investigation. And whether that's because of legal advice, fear of public backlash, or something else entirely, it doesn't change how it looks from the outside. When someone refuses to help in a case of this magnitude, it naturally raises questions. Even if legally speaking, he has every right to stay silent, it's probably not what he should be doing right now. On top of that, the same report claims that there's a likelihood that David had helped in dismembering or disposing of the body. Again, these aren't conclusions being made by the internet anymore. These are statements being attributed to law enforcement officials through major news outlets. And now we need to pair that with what TMZ reported. They said that the police are already viewing David as a suspect and are, quote, viewing Celeste's death as a homicide. So now this situation looks a lot more serious than it did just a week ago. What's wild is that the medical examiner has, quote, yet to determine cause or manner of death, according to the Citizen report. So for investigators to already be leaning in the direction of foul play and even implicating David to some extent says that they have at least some evidence, if not a lot of an idea of what was going on behind the scenes. All of this is starting to paint a picture that's very different from what we were debating online just a few weeks ago. It's not just messy anymore. It's not just rumors. These are established outlets citing police sources saying that he's not cooperating and that things are being treated like a homicide investigation. And whether or not this ultimately leads to any charges, today has undeniably shifted how the public will view David for the rest of his life. And as we go into the next section, I want to warn everybody that these updates are rather disturbing. The source also gave some updates on the timeline. We know that Celeste was found inside of David's Tesla.
a gruesome discovery in a tow yard.
The source also corroborated the fact that her body was very decomposed and not all together in one place. However, the police have not mentioned if they've found any other remains from the body in any other locations outside of the Tesla. And because the body was so heavily decomposed, it's been taking the medical examiner much longer than usual to try and figure out the story of what actually happened. But just to be very clear, after today, we can confirm that the police are handling this like a homicide investigation, regardless of what minimal evidence they have at the moment.
We are told they still do not have toxicology results from the medical examiner's office. However, what investigators do know so far is leading them to treat this as a homicide. They're still waiting for the medical examiner report to back that up, but they are viewing David as a suspect and viewing this as a homicide.
But what the source did mention is that the medical examiner is getting much closer to determining the cause of death. And once the examiner is able to do this, this is probably the most likely time where the police will move forward with charges and making an arrest. And speaking of arrests, we might not only be seeing one, because even though we've been focusing on David this whole time, because Celeste was found in his car, we don't know if he's the only one involved. According to the same source, the way that Celeste's body was disposed of could imply that there may have been some sort of help. So it's very possible at this point that whoever did do this terrible thing didn't do it alone.
What we're told, though, is the manner in which the body was dismembered leads police to believe that whoever did that to Celeste had help, that it was not something that whoever the person is who did it could have done by themselves.
It's horrible enough to imagine one person doing something so twisted, but the fact that someone else might be in on this whole situation is just horrifying. So at this point, we need to seriously start looking into not only who, but why someone would want this covered up if it does in fact tie back to David. Another alleged detail from this source is that apparently David would go to Santa Barbara County to take a mysterious day trip earlier this spring.
In the spring of 2025, they have information, police do, about David going to Santa Barbara County, a remote area of Santa Barbara County. That's how it was described to us, that he went to this remote area, spent several hours there, and then returned to LA.
This was apparently all the source was allowed to disclose, and nobody knows how or if this is relevant to the case, but many people are speculating that this could possibly be when David actually went to go see Celeste for the last time. And as far as timelines go, it kind of adds up. On top of all of this, as I mentioned earlier, the guy who owns the house that David had been living in actually hired a private investigator to look into the case. The reason that this is so relevant is because a private investigator isn't held to the same standard that any police officer or public official is. You see, throughout this investigation, the police have had to remain very quiet whether they want to or not, and there's a couple reasons for that. But mainly from a legal perspective, if you accuse someone of a crime without sufficient evidence, you can be held liable for defamation. Hence why I've said the word alleged so many times in this video, because until you're 100% sure that someone committed a crime, it's important to remember that people are innocent until proven guilty. But that being said, it seems like the internet's jury is out on David, and they've all but decided to put him behind bars for life. The police, on the other hand, could and would get sued into oblivion if they said something happened and it turned out to be untrue. Hence why they've said pretty much nothing until now. And even now, we're only hearing this through private sources as opposed to public statements. But like I said, the private investigator is allowed to talk, and according to him, the last time Celeste was seen alive was January 2nd of 2025.
The last date that we have that shows her alive is January 2nd, 2025.
Then, according to different surveillance cameras in the area, David's Tesla was seen around the neighborhood throughout May and finally abandoned in July.
That car, starting in May, was parked in a few different areas around that neighborhood. And then ultimately July 29th left in its final, parking spot on Bluebird. And this happens to be right before, or the same day that they're leaving on a tour bus to begin the tour. for David's, choice.
So the car could have been moving around for months to throw people off its tail, but they couldn't keep up with it once the tour started, hence why it ended up getting caught. Now, that's not anything that's been proven, and it's all just allegations, but I will also say the body was clearly decomposing for some period of time, and we'll have to wait for the medical examiner to come forward with more details on specifics of when Celeste may have actually died to see if this lines up. The same private investigator also mentioned that when he searched the home, there was still a lot of stuff left behind by LAPD that was a little bit concerning.
That I have, and I don't know, what LAPD has, but there was some media left behind at the house, and there's photos from a camera that David was using, and the last photo of Celeste is January 2nd of 2025.
Wow. Now, without revealing what you found, right? Because some things you may not be able to reveal. In what you went through in the house, did you find any evidence of criminal behavior?
So, it's not a crime to think about doing certain things, but we found some things that had been delivered to the house that just don't belong there, don't belong in any type of environment like that. And they are things that you could use to get rid of a person if you wanted to. And they're really, people say, oh, it's got to be tools and stuff. It's beyond that. It's really sadistic stuff. Now, LAPD didn't take it, but they have told us that they photographed it.
However, even after all of this evidence and new updates, TMZ also reported that an arrest in the David Celeste case is not imminent, according to their source at the LAPD. Fortunately or unfortunately, just because the internet and you and I believe that something might seem obvious doesn't mean that the police can act on it. They have to build a case that doesn't just hold up online, but also in court. So when a law enforcement source uses a phrase like not imminent, that tells you that they're not close enough to feel confident in taking the step to saying that David actually did something that needs to put him behind bars. However, this does not mean that nothing is happening. And it also doesn't mean that they have ruled anything out at this time. It just means that they're not willing to publicly commit to one direction or another until the evidence is more clear. That being said, it's important that we keep Celeste and her family in our thoughts and prayers as this case moves forward, and just hope no matter who did this terrible thing, that Celeste and her family can finally receive justice.